Good evening, and yeah, great to have you all here on a very, very cold evening in Poland. Temperature's been down to like, -11. Yeah, so it's pretty cold here, -11 Celsius. So welcome, and yeah, today I want to just continue with the series I was discussing before, and then what was interesting was that the section that I was doing on the Septuagint obviously took on a life of its own, and I did 2 episodes just on the Septuagint issues. That had a lot of positive interest, so I've covered them in depth, but I did kind of get off of the presentation. So just like to go back to that and just finish those slides, and then we can move on to the next questions. So welcome, Dragon. Good to see you. Mike, welcome. Michael Lawler, Artsy Fartsy. Hello there. So yeah, I'd like to just go back to the issue of it's really about Sola Scriptura, but also it's about the historical issues that I personally became uncomfortable with, because we're dealing with claims that I somehow could not find any historical substantiation for, that somehow the Bible came into existence through magic. Effectively is what it seems to boil down to. And yeah, so -7 in Finland. Yeah, it's cold. Yeah, so it's gotten down to lower than that here, Carol. So yeah, Dragon, great to see you. Um, yeah. Okay, well, let me jump into the last slide. That one of the last slides, and just go back over this. I may not go in much depth because I've covered it before, but I just want to make it again so that it's part of this sequence. Just at least I've done them and addressed them, and brought attention to the issues, and then we'll go on to onto some of the new slides. So, right now, the last slide, the last point that I made here is relevant to the issue of Sola Scriptura. So by making the claims that we're making, as I was saying, as part of the series, Protestants position themselves as having greater insight or guidance than the apostles and the early church, which is scripturally and historically problematic. The reason for that, just briefly then, is that the early church, and the evidence here is overwhelming, used the Septuagint. That was the Greek translation made by Jews in as early as 280 BC. The Greeks translated from the Hebrew to the Jews translated from the Hebrew to the Greek, and that is the version of the Bible that the apostles used. And of course, there's been a lot of, shall we say, revision of history to deny this and to move to a different translation. And we've gone over some of the issues we've discovered with that. So for Protestants to reject the Bible, the literal Bible that Jesus used and the apostles used, and say, no, we've got to use this one instead, that causes an issue. Well, we've already discussed that, so I won't litigate all of that in detail now. So now, Jesus again literally draws on the Septuagint tradition. In Isaiah 29:13, for instance, in the Masoretic, and the Lord said, "For as much as this people draw near, and with their mouth and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment of men learned by rote." So this is what is said in the Hebrew version of the Bible, the Masoretic. In the Septuagint, we have a different translation. "And they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, but in vain do they worship me, teaching the commandments and doctrines of men, but in vain do they worship me." So this is from Lancelot Charles Lee Brenton, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, English translation, 1870, right? Isaiah 29:13. And I've already discussed at length before how these two translations, the one is from a tradition that does not revere the Messiah, doesn't recognize Jesus as the Son of God. Therefore, it translates these texts in a way that denies his divinity. It either literally strips out whole sentences, removes miracles, removes references to worship given to Jesus, and this conflicts heavily with the version of the Bible that the apostles are using. If you read that particular translation, that tradition of translation, you are not going to find the Messiah. So this leads to an argument, creates a massive divide. You cannot find the Jesus we know in the version of the Bible that the Jews use, and that many argue is the only correct version of the Bible. And this, of course, would lead to one to look at Jesus as less than divine. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, the people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoureth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. That's Matthew 15, 7-9 in the KJV version. So we see here that Matthew is echoing the words of the Septuagint. To continue, so Jesus says that even in the Old Testament, they were worshipping him. So this isn't a direct allusion to Jesus' divinity, even within the Old Testament. Now, in the Septuagint, the Bible translation that paved the way to Christianity, this is Professor James Aitken. He says Jews could read and write Greek to a high level. This was in response to the claim that the Jews did not have a good understanding of Greek. Sometimes when people look at the translation, they look at the language and say the language is not very good, or the language shows influence from Hebrew, because of course it's a translation. But people often then say the translation was done very badly, and this is a misrepresentation. Jews would, as other people in Egypt, have known Greek to a high level, and when we think they've written what some people say is bad Greek, it's more that it's not at the highest literary level, but it's actually because it is a translation, and all translations show interference from the Hebrew. That is to say, they follow the Hebrew word order, for example. So it's a translation that is not trying to achieve necessarily the highest literary format, but it's trying to be an accurate translation from the Hebrew using the Greek language. Right. So welcome, Villainous. Good to see you. So the New Testament Septuagint versus the Masoretic text, looking at the Incarnation. Again, I've covered this, so I'll try not to spend too much time. The Son speaks to the Father in Hebrews 10:5. Right. They're citing Psalm 40. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. Then said, behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God. Now, if you look at the Tanakh, if you look at the Masoretic, the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic text, 1917, with reference to Psalm 40, sacrifice and meal offering thou hast no delight in. Mine ears hast thou opened. So compare a body you have prepared for me. So the Messiah coming down, being born, and then, you compare that to mine ears hast thou opened. Which one speaks of Jesus? Which translation is, well, if you translate mine ears hast thou opened, you're going to go, there's nothing divine here about this man. This is just some guy that his ears are opened. He's gone woke, right? As opposed to a body you have prepared for me. I should note, though, that a body you have prepared for me, some scholars also view that not just as Jesus having a body made for him that he will be born into, incarnated into, but also the church, a body, the church that you have prepared for me. So let me see. Modern scholarship does breed arrogance. Villainous, you make a very good point here. I don't understand, he says, why people think the ancient people were complete morons who couldn't effectively understand multiple languages. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, all ancient people are supposed to be incredibly ignorant and stupid. Yeah, fair point, one. Yeah, very good point. Right. Villain, if you'd like to come up, you are welcome. I'll drop the link and I'll leave it up to you if you so choose. I'm dropping this in the chat right now, and if you want to come up and join me, you are welcome to. Welcome, Archambault. Okay, let me continue. So the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, English translation, Psalm 39. Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body thou hast prepared for me. Very interesting. Other examples of the New Testament uses the Septuagint over the Hebrew texts are the virgin birth. For instance, Matthew 1:23 cites Isaiah 7:14, saying, the young woman shall conceive. So the word virgin, right, in the Septuagint, Isaiah 7:14, was chosen by Jews in roughly 200 BC. This is before Christianity, right? And this is not a 400 AD translation, as some have attempted to argue. Some have tried to make the argument that, no, this was a Christian interpolation from 400 AD. But for some reason, these Jewish translators, took the Hebrew Alma, right? So they went from Hebrew Alma to the Greek Parthenos, which means virgin explicitly. So it seems there was this tradition that viewed the Bible in this way. There was even, you can find a tradition where God was seen as a Godhead with multiple persons in it. So this was a tradition that once this created this kind of friction within Christianity, this had to be removed. The Bible, it would seem, had to be changed to this non-divine, non-Trinitarian variant to not give the Christian position any credence. So there seems to have been, well, let's just say there's a question about the way that the translation was made in the Masoretic. Yeah, fair enough. The church was good enough to shortlist the New Testament canon, but not reliable to finalize the Old Testament canon. Yeah, no, there's questions, and I've raised all those questions. And yeah, so in Jesus' ministry, Luke 4:18, they cite Isaiah 61. Now, the Masoretic text lacks recovery of the sight to the blind. This is one of the miracles of Jesus, and one of the prophecies made about him. The Masoretic removes that completely. And then the crucifixion, citing Psalms 22:16. Piercing hands and feet, as previously referenced. Now, of course, lots of paper and lots of ink have been spilled to say that, well, this means, you see, because I covered this again at length multiple times already, but it's supposed to say, like a lion, my hands and my feet, which makes no sense. And of course, older translations of the actual Hebrew have been discovered, older than or different from a different site than the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they agree with the Septuagint. So not like a lion, my hands and my feet, but actually they pierced my hands and my feet. So that's the significance of that. So angels worship Jesus in Hebrew 1:6. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he saith, and let all the angels of God worship him. In the Masoretic text, this highlighted phrase, let all the angels of God worship him, that's omitted. It's missing. So yeah. Now, Augustine of Hippo. So the Septuagint was translated from old and accurate Hebrew copies, and newer research on newer papers are published with new research from other sites other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we are finding that these original Hebrew texts actually validate the Septuagint, they actually validate the Greek translation. So the Greek translation does come from an accurate Hebrew translation, or from an accurate original Hebrew source. And that's kind of my point, Villainous. If Jesus evidences his messianic position while on earth and quotes the Septuagint, then the Septuagint is valid. How can people come along in the 16th, 17th century and say, yeah, Jesus used the wrong Bible? That's a pretty weighty claim to make. And that's a dismissal of the tradition of Jesus and the apostles, and saying, no. Us guys here, 1500, 1600, 1700 years later, we got it right. Jesus and the apostles, yeah, they used the corrupted Bible. I've already covered at length how Protestant scholars from the 16, 17, 1800s were blatantly saying the Bible was corrupted. The apostles, that version of the Bible is not available anymore. It's a corrupted Bible, and therefore we had to go to a different one because the Bible is corrupted. That sounds like a familiar argument, but yes. Okay, moving on. So it is the most appropriate text for us to use in our present chronicle, especially since the Church of Christ, which has spread throughout the world, supports only this version, and since the apostles and disciples of Christ used and transmitted this version. Now that's written by Eusebius in his chronography, right? And then, for it was the counsel of God carried out for the benefit of Greek ears. It was not alien to the inspiration of God, who gave the prophecy, also to produce the translation and make it, as it were, Greek prophecy. To this day, at the temple of Serapis, the libraries of Ptolemy are to be seen with the identical Hebrew originals in them. And that's Clement of Alexandria, one of the fathers of the church. Now, this is also an issue that we must address, because within the Protestant church, within the Westminster Confession of Faith, it says, yes, only the Hebrew Masoretic version of the Bible, of the Old Testament, is accurate. Of course, the New Testament in Greek is just fine. It's perfect. That's inspired the whole word of God. But the Greek version of the Old Testament, no. That's just not good enough. That was just some fiction that a bunch of guys wrote that yeah, we just really got to ignore that one, which is fascinating, which goes against the historical evidence. And this is a fair, true point. Neil says Protestant hatred for Rome is greater than the reliance on the judgment of Jesus himself. It's bizarre. It's crazy. And these are the questions that I've been asking. This is the evidence that I've been collecting and I'm looking at, and I'm going, yeah, this makes no sense. This violates the tradition of Jesus. This violates the tradition of the apostles. And if Protestants claim we're going back to the early tradition of the church, we're going back to the apostolic tradition, and then, yeah, we don't like the apostolic Bible. The Bible the apostles used, yeah, that one's corrupt. That's going to lead to questions, and I think it just leads directly to hypocrisy and falsehood. So that's my view. Right. Okay, let's continue. And then, of course, here we've got Justin Martyr with Trypho the Jew, right? Around about 120. But I am far from putting reliance in your teachers who refuse to admit that the interpretation made by the 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, the king of the Egyptians, he's the one who requested a version of the Bible in Greek to go into the library in Alexandria, right, is a correct one. So in other words, already the Jews were saying, no, that Bible's not the right one. We know from evidence now that Bible was even in Jerusalem being used there. And they attempt to frame another. I wish you to observe that they have altogether taken away many scriptures from the translations. They've removed books from the Bible suddenly, affected by those 70 elders who were with Ptolemy, by which this very man who was crucified is proved to have been set forth expressly as God. So the Jews were removing evidence from the Bible that proved that Jesus was God. Isn't that interesting? And man as being crucified and is dying. But since I'm aware that this is denied by all of your nation, I do not address myself to these points, but I proceed to carry on my discussions by means of these passages, which are still admitted by you. For you assent to those which I have brought before your attention, except that you contradict the statement, behold, the virgin shall conceive, and say, no, it ought to be that the young woman shall conceive. And I promise to prove that the prophecy referred not, as you were taught, to Hezekiah, but to this Christ of mine. And now I shall go to the proof. So this argument is an old one. And the evidence is now starting to collect that the Septuagint is a faithful rendition, and it is the Bible that was used by the early church, even by Jesus and the apostles, quoted by them, and it comes from a reliable Hebrew source. Right. Now, critical editing of the Hebrew was undertaken by rabbinical scholars and the Masoretic. Now, that's from the 6th to the 10th century. So the Masoretic text as we know it, really this group from the 6th to the 10th, well, technically into the 11th century, they were recreating the Bible. So, and of course, you had the members of the heretical Karaite sect. Now, you have the rabbinic Jews and you've got the Karaites, who are heretical Jewish sect. And this Jewish sect is a little Islamified. I've covered that again in depth, but I'll try and go over the detail. And hello there, Neutron Star Academy. Welcome. Technically, I'm a Protestant, so don't shoot. Well, technically, so am I. So that's the issue. But I'm looking at the evidence. I'm looking at the history. And I'm going, yeah, this story does not add up. And the story definitely. Also, as you know, I need to continue my Martin Luther series, and I think I believe I've done the most detailed, most in-depth analysis of Martin Luther, both historically and from his own writings. And when you read Martin Luther's writings, you realize the man is incoherent, and at best, I would classify him as a theological fraud. And there are some serious issues with Martin Luther, and that's how I got onto this. So let me continue. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Let me go back. So the heretical Karaite sect. Let me just. That wasn't a link, so I don't have to stress about that. Let me just continue then. I thought this was supposed to be a link, but it appears not to be. So I'll just continue. Now, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible dates only from 1008 AD, give or take a year or two. That's the 11th century. That's many centuries after the Septuagint. We know the Septuagint dates from almost 300 BC. Now, you're looking at a Bible that was completed in the early 11th century, right? And you're looking at a Bible that is almost 1,300 years older. And everyone's going, now, that Bible from 1,300 years before this one, that's from the 1000s. Yeah, the one from the 1000s is the solid one. And Islam, because the closer you are to today, the more accurate. That's why Islam is more reliable, because it comes from the 600s and 700s rather than from 2000 years, before, etc. Yeah, same argument. So the oldest complete Hebrew Bible, it dates from 1008 AD, the 11th century. So this is 1200 years, 1300 years after the Septuagint. Yet the Masoretic is the text underlying nearly every modern Old Testament translation. So the Masoretic text is the Hebrew version that is behind virtually all translation of the OT. However, it has been noted by Danish biblical scholar Mogens Møller that historically the Septuagint should be endowed with a special significance, right? Considered as a translation because to some circles of Greek-speaking Jewry, it replaced the Biblia Hebraica and thus became their Bible. It was accepted as conclusive evidence of the biblical revelation. It was used by the authors of the New Testament writings accordingly came to have a decisive impact on the theology of the New Testament. In a historical perspective, it became, to an even greater extent than the Biblia Hebraica, the Old Testament of the New Testament. This circumstance is fundamental, insofar as this translation, as a witness to the handing on of traditions, represents a reappraisal of the basic content of the Old Testament. According to Robert Hanhart, it even expresses a more profound appreciation of the Old Testament's testimony of revelation than the Hebrew. So, yeah, and that's actually a truth here. Dexius de Toledo, we inherit the Hellenistic Jewish tradition. Exactly. There's actually truth in that. Sola Scriptura, yay or nay? Nay. It's just, yeah. So, yeah. So you were. Oh wow! Thank you, Neil D. Says your series on Lucifer opened my eyes. Man, reading Lucifer, wow! It shocked me how, when I was reading theologians who discuss him and historians, and you read Luther's life, his thinking, the effects of his actions, you start to look. I could only start to see him as the Muhammad of Germany, and that the narrative we were reading of Luther is roughly the same as that of Muhammad. It's all whitewashed. It's all artificial, and yeah, Luther was a psychopath. So yeah, that's the conclusion I eventually came to. So the Sadducees, Jesus and Torah alone. Now, the idea of the Bible alone, I mean, this is a very commonplace, very much ingrained Protestant position. It's also a very new position, but it's based on an old heresy. Sadducees are understood to accept only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, as authoritative, and they rejected the oral Torah. These are traditions and interpretations developed by the Pharisees, right? Now, Josephus states that the Sadducees receive no observance at all beyond what is written in the law of Moses. That's Antiquities of the Jews. And then, of course, the Sadducees hold that only written laws are reckoned valid, but that those handed down by traditions from the fathers need not be observed. So that's fascinating. Only what is written, but what was unwritten, what is known and preserved in various traditions, that's got to go. So in Acts 23:8, it mentions that the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, while the Pharisees acknowledge these, implying a strict adherence to the written Torah without the additional interpretations or traditions that supported these beliefs amongst the Pharisees. So Jesus' interaction with the Sadducees. Now, think of the implication. If there's no resurrection, no angels, no spirit, where would that leave you theologically in a Christian context? Even the Pharisees admitted to those things because that is what they learned as part of their tradition. So in the New Testament, Jesus directly addresses the Sadducees' misunderstanding of Scripture. In Matthew 22:23-33, the Sadducees who deny the resurrection question Jesus about marriage after the resurrection. And Jesus replies to them in Matthew 22, verse 29, and he says, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." Jesus directly condemns their Scripture alone position. At the time, the Scripture was the Torah. The New Testament had not been written yet. So, of course, only the Old Testament. And he says, no, you're wrong. You are ignoring the tradition of those who came before you. So even Jesus rejected the scripture alone position. Johnny, welcome. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, let's see if I've missed anything. Yeah, the Didache. Yeah, I know lots of people want to claim the Didache is from the 4th or 5th century. I've seen that as well. And more and more research into the Didache and some of these older texts show that these are from before the Gospels were written. So that it's very probably the earliest written early church text, the oldest preserved early church text from as potentially as early as the year 48. So that's extremely ancient. Yeah, so hold on, let's see. Okay, so let's continue. So the Karaites, right? This is by Kola, Abram Darkavi. So the Karaites, now they're important because these were Islamized Jews in a real sense. And I'll look at some of that now. They were followers of the Bible only. So they picked up from the Sadducees and they were scripture alone Jews. So they were a Jewish sect professing to follow the Bible to the exclusion of rabbinical traditions and laws. They rejected authority of the elders. They rejected earlier tradition. They said, no, only the book. Well, where'd the book come from? The book came from the people who passed on the tradition. This is very similar position to the Protestant position. It's like, we're not interested in the church, just the book. We'll take the book. The church was good enough to give us the book, but the church itself, not good enough, right? So charism, right? It borrowed from earlier or later Jewish sects like the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Esawites, the Incarnates, as well as from the Mohammedans. Now, this doesn't go, the Jewish encyclopedia doesn't say much here, but it says it borrowed from the Muslims. Interesting. So these people borrowed from the Muslims. Let's continue. So the Karaites were Sola Scriptura Jews. Now, remember, they were integral to the translation of the Bible again, of this new interpretation of the Bible, the Masoretic. They were very much involved with this particular refutation, shall we say, in a real sense, refutation of the Septuagint in the Masoretic. So the Masoretic was to correct the error of the Masoretic. So Karaites, from the Hebrew kara, to read. Karaites, kara, karan. Interesting. See, kara, karan, to read. A Jewish sect that emerged in 700 AD. They emphasized the written Torah, the Tanakh, as the sole source of religious law. They rejected the oral law and the authority of the Talmud, which they saw as a substitute man-made law. Okay? They excluded, as if the Bible wasn't written by men, because as you know, the Bible just fell down one day, boom, straight from heaven. Not touched by human hands whatsoever, apparently. They excluded Jesus' messianism. So they said, no, Jesus couldn't be the Messiah. The Bible needs to reflect that, because the false Septuagint says that Jesus is the Messiah. We can't have that. We need a new translation, a fixed one, to understand the theological implication here for Christianity. So Karaite belief, every person has the right to understand the word of the Torah in their own way. In other words, everyone can declare their own gender. So do you see the problem with that? You see, and if everyone understands the book their own private way, that's called subjectivism, that's relativism, that's everyone can make it up and interpret it as they please, in which case you have no truth because you only have wildly varying opinions. And some people are intelligent and some are not. Some are idiots, some are clued up, some are clueless. And you're just going to have a riot of opinions. So no intermediaries are required to mediate between humans and God. Is any of this familiar? Does this sound like modern day Protestantism, which goes back to, good old Martin Luther's days, and the people that Martin Luther got his wacky ideas from? So they were Jewish Protestants. They were rehashing former heresies, and they were holding non-uniform beliefs. And artsy-fartsy, this is exactly what the Bible actually says. Everything is right in his and her own eyes. Yes. So let's continue with the Karaites. So the Septuagint was widely used by Greek-speaking Jews in the Greek and Roman worlds. That's the majority of the Jews because there was the diaspora, right? So the Jews had spread. Greek was the majority language. And this Septuagint had significant authority. So this changed only after disputes with Christians who cited its messianic prophecies in support of Jesus. And of course, many of these Greeks were like, no, we can't have that. So evidence of original Christian writings, the Gospels, the Acts, the Epistles, appearing alongside Old Testament books emerged in the mid-2nd century. Right. So the New Testament wasn't around before Jesus, departure, and it came much later than had to be written. So Jewish scripture became the Christian Bible. Early Christian church accepted it as their Old Testament, and they interpreted through their faith in Jesus Christ. And exactly, but this is you are your own pope, Willis, and that's literally what Martin Luther wrote. That is literally what Martin Luther wrote. You are your own pope. Well, if you're the head of your own church, if you're the head of your own religion, then you have a lot of arguing people who are heads of their own religion. So this aligns with what the gospel describes Jesus himself doing. Right. This approach begins with the New Testament and then revisits the Old Testament, suggesting that the Old Testament is best understood through the lens of the New Testament. The shadows in the Old Testament become clear in the New Testament. And through reading the New Testament, you understand the allusions and the prophecies that are now seen clearly inside the Old Testament. So there's deep theological disagreement in the interpretive traditions between the Hebraic/Masoretic and the Septuagint Catholic Bible. And the Bible is most definitely historically a Catholic book. So the church accepted the Septuagint as its official Bible. That's the early church. So initially this applied to the Pentateuch. However, the rest of the text was translated in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And some of that's even, in fact, we know now that the Septuagint was completed by, at latest, like 150, 130 BC. So it took all of 4 centuries to complete the rest of the Bible. This was taken up by various translators, exhibiting various translation techniques. In addition to the Old Greek text, the Septuagint also added a number of books entitled de novo Greek books, such as the New Greek books, such as Wisdom, Judith, Baruch, the Letter of Jeremiah, 1 and 2 Maccabees, including Greek additions to Esther and Daniel. So these developments inevitably led to Judaism dispensing with the Septuagint. Now, what is interesting is, now I'm quoting this in full as it is, but the discovery of 8 Hever, so that's Nahal Hever, that's another repository. Oh, hold on, Villain, oh my gosh, you just popped up. Sorry, I didn't see you, Villainous. How are you doing?
And not too bad, mate. I'm sitting in a library. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you. Great. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on. Yeah. So,
Wonderful.
yeah. Go on.
Oh, I was just saying g'day. I'll just pop in when I've got a question, I think.
Good day, mate. Yeah. So tell us, what impression are you taking away of this so far? I know I'm kind of rehashing points I've made before, but I want to get through these and go back onto the rest of the history. What are your thoughts here and your takeaways?
Well, overall, with the whole issue with the Sola Scriptura thing, there's a lack of appreciation for the work done by the early church and the order in which everything happened. Like there was no New Testament in Jesus' time. It's not like there's some magical event that happened. The church was building up and people were writing stuff. So Paul would write stuff and Peter would write stuff. And people would realize over time that, oh, hang on, this is like super important work, and we'll latch onto it. And so over a period of time, it was accepted. Now, sure, the Holy Spirit would have worked with Peter and Paul, etc., at the time, but it's just to think that these writings came out of nothing is not correct. That they're written by people, the same as the Old Testament, right? They were written by people, moved by the Holy Spirit, and over time, people realize, oh, hang on, this is actually it really is showing what God's doing in the world, and it needs to be accepted. So, I'm sorry, it wasn't Council of Nicaea that invented all this stuff. That was, the church had already worked it out prior to that, and it was written by people at certain times. It's not people really need to get the handle on the flow of writing and acceptance, which didn't happen by itself. It's in Islam, it tends to have that feel, doesn't it? You've got this Quran that got turned up by God one day, and poof, there it was.
Yeah.
Whereas we're quite clear that in Christianity that no, this is written by Paul, this is written by Peter, this is written by Luke, and we should be accepting it as such.
Yeah, and there was a historical process, and we know from the writings, from the history, it took centuries. And in many cases, these were things that were accepted by the church. And for decades or centuries, it would simply just continue as a habitual practice because this was the accepted tradition. But then something egregious would happen. You have a major heretic come along, and there'd be a major storm in the church. And then the church was forced at that point to codify something. So the Council of Nicaea was again another one of those enforced actions where they had to codify things because of heresies that were threatening the church. So now they had to go, hold on, wait. Okay, we've all held this belief for decades, for centuries, but because of this Arius issue, we now have to write this down and make this doctrine. We have to pass this as canon law because it's causing confusion. Whereas, because there was revolt against church tradition. So yeah, history also needs to be respected because that's what we have records of. That's
right. The Nicene Creed is exactly that, isn't it? I mean, it's basically a statement about of faith that we all use, right? But it's in response to particular issues that were going on in the time, and you've done it yourself, Lord. You've got that. This one side with the various statements. On the other side, you've got this is the heresy that it refers to, and there's a whole bunch of them. And it is, and I think that been happening over and over again. Heresies turn up. I think that's one of the problems with Protestantism. I'm like Lloyd, by the way. I attend an Anglican church, so I don't have any I don't have any vested interest in terms of being Catholic particularly. But the point being is that things come along. Oh yeah, this is it. There we go. Yeah, so it's against various things, and they just turn up. And with modern Protestantism, we're rife with repeating a lot of this stuff. That we things like what do you call it? Oh yeah, the sort of Jesus and being and God, modalism. Sorry, yeah, modalism is becoming quite prevalent nowadays. I mean, that's just this ancient heresy that people have dug up again.
It just recycles, and they come in slightly different. It's like the same thing in a new hat.
Yeah, and there's still Gnostics around. Like
that has exploded.
Like first century type Gnostics, not just the concept of which I know you talk about Gnosticism a bit on the channel, which is more a theme type idea where you can associate Gnosticism with other things, well, even in Islam, it's saying, you've got bits where it says, Islam is clearly saying itself as Gnostic, but it's not like the exact same Gnosticism from the first and second centuries. It's a different type, but there are still today like first and second century style Gnostics. They got some fantasy about going back to the old days and rehashing it. It's really crazy.
And when you read the Gnostic cosmology and theology, it's bizarre. It is like fiction. I mean, it's like just utterly bizarre, unprovable myth. It's crazy the things they say. Yeah. Just so everyone knows, the Nicene Creed was a refutation of various heresies. We believe in one God was deliberately put there against the Gnostics, the Father, the Almighty, against the Gnostics. And notice, also against the Muslims now. And the Muslims, within the Sharia, they claim blatantly to be Gnostics. It explicitly says in the Sharia, Muslims are Gnostics. Maker of heaven and earth against the Gnostics, of all that is seen and unseen. And then again, you've got against the Arians and against adoptionism, eternally begotten of the Father. And then against the Arians, God from God, light from light. You have against Docetism and Ebionism. He was born of the Virgin Mary and became man. So these statements in the Creed were explicitly written to deal with and refute specific heresies because the church was forced to make it explicit. So it's not like this was invented in 621 and was never part of no, it was always part of the church's belief. But at some point, something happened and they said, hey guys, look, we need to make this written and recorded now.
Yeah, that's right. So the canon's the same, which is really what we're talking about today, right? The canon has a situation where you got thousands of books and people are making up brand new ones all the time every 5 minutes. And they need to say, well, there's a lot of crap going around. Let's stick with this stuff. And it was formal. They had criteria as to why the ones were chosen in the New Testament, and most of it was quite legitimate. It's either written by an apostle or one level down. So, like, Luke is not an apostle, right, in the sense that he was one of the 12, but he walked around with Paul. He knew the inner sanctum, what have you. There's arguments to be said that maybe he was in contact with Mary, etc. With part of the early parts of his gospel. I'm not going to sort of hang my neck on that one, but it's quite reasonable to assume that. But the point being is that there's good reason to have them. How could you argue that a gospel written by the actual guy couldn't be included, whereas other ones are not? Even though it's attributed to Thomas or something, it was written way too late, and it's clearly not associated with Christianity at all, and so it was ignored. And there would have been lots like that. And so the actual, but that's a process inside the church, right? It's not a book suddenly pops out of the sky and jumps in front of the Pope and says, use this. It was a process. The church,
it was centuries.
The church itself has run that process and selected these books to be what they consider to be a holy writ. It's the church that declared that.
Yeah. And Jesus didn't leave a book, and it's crazy how there seems to be this implication that Jesus left a book. No, he left a church. He granted the Holy Spirit to the church. The authority that he left behind was that of the church, which is the pillar and ground of truth. And it doesn't say the Bible is the pillar and ground of truth anywhere in the Bible. It says the church. And by the way, just there's a comment here from that below. Islam stole traditional clothing and hopes of claiming to be Abrahamic, and then so on. Just to clarify for the audience, the claim of Abrahamism or to be Abrahamic in Islam is something that really only started in Islam apparently after the Jews rejected the claims of Muhammad, right? But notice that Abraham in Islam teaches hatred of Jews and Christians. It's interesting that Christians went around at the time of Abraham, and he's the first Jew, but Abraham hates Jews and Christians. So you go to Quran 60 verse 4, and it says, we are completely quit of you, and whatever you worship apart from Allah, we disbelieve in you, and between you and us enmity, translated as hostility, hatred, ill will, animosity, and antagonism has appeared, and abhorrence, which is extreme repugnance, loathing, abomination, forever until you believe in Allah alone. So now, if you go into the Creed, and this verse, Quran verse 60, verse 4, of hatred towards Jews and Christians from Muslims, saying that no, Abraham actually hates Jews, Abraham hates Christians, and as Muslims, to be loyal to Allah, we have to hate you too. And this creates the doctrine of what's called al-wala wal-bara, right? So the doctrine of loyalty and disavowal. We are loyal to Allah, and we hate who Allah hates. And Allah hates you. Are you a Muslim? No, then Allah hates you. So after you love Allah and His Messenger, Allah obligates you to hate those who oppose Allah and His Messenger. We hate the people of shirk. Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you believe in the Trinity? Well, you're the people of shirk. Muslims are required to hate you. And this obligation comes from the creed of Abraham, the creed we are ordered to follow. And this is in the Aqidah, the creed of Islam. So Muslims, as part of the creed, are required to hate Jews and Christians. Literally, Islam is hate speech. Your thoughts there, Linus?
Well, it's obviously that the obvious thing is quoting Abraham for this is just crazy. It's Abraham was the founder of monotheism, which was being worked through God, through the Jews primarily at the start, right? So basically, you're saying that God stuffed up in terms of his managing the nation that is we currently called people who are now Jews, right? So he stuffed up. So he was almost did Allah commit shirk by stuffing up. It seems to be crazy, and really, the Christian heritage is uses the Old Testament completely. It's not like we rewrote to suit ourselves. We just continued on using the same book, right?
Yeah.
So the Christian and Jewish heritage is consistent in that fashion, and really Islam has to prove itself to be somehow uniquely new, or that the Judaism and Christianity have failed to maintain that. I think they have the duty to prove, and they just can't do it. Right? They've got no evidence apart from there's no historical evidence that
it's all circular claims. I mean, the Quran is useless. It's completely irrelevant and completely useless in, say, archaeological terms. It has been used to validate or verify or locate nothing in an archaeological sense, whereas the Bible is a major text used in archaeology to find or validate things, identify what they are, where they are. Yeah.
Can't even validate its own main towns. You dig up in Mecca, and what do they find? A 12th century Ottoman fort or something, and that's it. Well done, guys.
Yeah. Now, also another common thing is that another common claim by scholars is that, oh, look at all of these conflicting translations of the Bible. No, sometimes these translators would, as they're working through, like, remember, they didn't have the modern eases, modern conveniences we have today, like computers and printers. They would take a long time to scribe and to write out the Bible. And as they were going, they would change their translation so that even in the middle of a chapter, they might decide on a new approach to translation, from word for word to thought for thought, or a combination of those. So you see continuous revision of previous translations. So it's not that these are different, but they were trying to refine the translation and improve the translation. Now, the phrasing in this text above, added a number of books, is highly misleading here, unfortunately. These books were part of the Septuagint by the 1st or 2nd century BC, and that's a century or more before Christianity started. So even within these academic texts, you'll find that there are errors that creep in, or biases based on theological biases that are evident even from these scholarly works. But of course, it does say the Septuagint is a holy text, the first Bible of the Holy Church. At least this is something that is very well confirmed in academia. Right. So the Karaites, the Masoretes in Islam. Now, this is a Braille paper. This is the role of the Karaites in the transmission of the Hebrew Bible and the practice of transcribing it into Arabic script. So the Karaites were very much involved in translation with the rabbinical Jews in creating this new Masoretic, and then they translated it further into Arabic because these guys were bum chums with the Muslims. So in the Middle Ages, the Karaite Jews in the Islamic world used both Arabic and Hebrew script. They wrote not only Arabic texts in Arabic script, but also many of their Hebrew Bibles in Arabic transcription. So let me just go to this here. Let me close that. See if that's relevant to us. Okay, so the Masoretes and the translators, now the Karaites and the Czech brethren. Let me see if I have this correct. You see, this is something I need to bring up. Okay, for some reason this link is...
Something's gone wrong there, isn't it?
Yeah, something's definitely gone wrong. Yeah. So yeah, something's gone wrong here, unfortunately. Not sure exactly why and what, because also this is supposed to be highlighted. There's supposed to be very specific sections. But what is evident from this, I'll just drop this link in the chat again. I've covered this before, so it's fine. It's in the previous talks. I've got some pop-ups on this, so I just don't want to litigate the same old story again. But these guys were cheek to cheek with the Muslims. These guys were very close to the Muslims, and they were very much using, shall we say, Islamic principles of translation when they were doing the translation of the Hebrew Bible, which I think this would be very questionable. So I don't want to go over all of this again. It's a very long article. I had highlighted all of the relevant sections. It's no longer there, but I've covered this before. Yeah.
Maybe you're on the original by accident or something.
Say again, please.
Maybe you're on the original by accident rather than your one with highlights.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I've got with one of the highlights. I've covered it before in previous episodes. I mean, it's something people can go back to if it's critical. But a comparison, let me just continue with this. It's something I've done before, and I don't want to do it again. Good night, Artsy Fartsy. Take care. See you soon. So a comparison between Karaites and Protestants goes back to the 16th century. That reminds me as well. Let me go to, I'll cover that one later. Goes back to the 16th century. In religious polemics, the Catholics reprimanded the adherents of the Reformation for their reliance on the Bible exclusively and the rejection of the tradition by comparing them with Karaites. Karaite Masoretes produced the most reliable text of the Hebrew Bible, at least that's the claim. And the Czech Brethren cared about an appropriate translation of the Bible. The Czech Brethren, those would be certain, shall we say, people influenced by Jan Hus and various other heretical movements in that part of the world. And so they rejected the Septuagint, which is going to lead to a very different theological viewpoint than those who are working with the Septuagint. Okay, so let me see, do I need to bring this up? No, that's fine, I'll skip this. Now, there's something very interesting, this little paper. I'll bring up this, though. Karaites and Reformers, 2 failed cases of coherent interpretation. And I'll just bring that up before we move to the next point. So from this paper, there are 2 main groups which claim that proper textual interpretation does not require extra textual information. Now, you need to understand that when you write something, you've got an oral tradition that's existed for some time, and then you write it down. It becomes a summary of decades, perhaps centuries of activities that have occurred. So your written text is a summary which includes a lot of assumptions. When someone divorces that written text from the experience of those who were there and from the oral tradition that accompanied it, then they will start making up their own views and their own opinions of what's in the text. And they're ignoring all of the history that came before. And this is a case that we're dealing with here. So he says, in this paper, there are 2 groups which claim that proper textual interpretation does not require extra textual information. They posit that the meaning of the text is discoverable from the words of the text or an individual's reason alone. Reason would be your opinion. Thus, no extra textual information is required to arrive at a coherent interpretation. The medieval Karaites reject the notion that there's any such thing as interpretive precedent, so there is no context to an interpretation in history or from past action, from tradition. Everyone's interpretation, guided by reason, is as valid and coherent as anyone else's. So you can make up literally any interpretation from a text, and your view is as good as anyone else's, because that leads to the claim that there is no truth. There is only your truth. And that is not a coherent doctrine. Your thoughts on this so far, Willem?
Yeah, well, it's starting to sound Gnostic, isn't it? You start to make up stuff to suit yourself. I think that's one of the problems people have. They seek their own self-importance in terms of the way they're approaching God, and are not letting God tell you who he is. You tell God who he is, the other way around. I made a little comment before about Calvinism on that in the chat, where it's unfortunately is a bit of a human condition that we like to think of ourselves better than we are, and we're quite happy to tell God who he is, rather than put up with how God has been telling us who he is. And I think that's a bit like that. I think I'm not too familiar with the Karaites. They're a type of branch of Judaism, isn't it?
They were often called Muslim Jews. They've actually been called Muslim Jews. Right. They're heresy. I mean, they're Jewish heresy, and they're Sola Scriptura, Protestant Muslim Jews.
Yeah, they're just trying to make the worst case scenario. That's a bit crazy, but yeah. But I think one of the issues I have with I think you sort of mentioned that we sort of at the start we're talking about it, and I did make a comment about it, is that Jesus was quite happy to use the Septuagint in his discussions.
Yes.
And the difference between that and some random Karaite saying, "Oh, we want to use it this way," is that Jesus was quite capable of proving who he was through the miracles that he did, and his personal integrity, and his his sermons and what he spoke about, the Sermon on the Mount, things like that. They're all backing each other up, you see. Whereas the Karaites, Yeah. So that whether Karaites or Calvin or anybody, they're not doing that. They're just that maybe they've got good intentions and they're trying to do the right thing. I don't know. But the point is they're doing it off their own cuff, and they're don't have the authority of God behind them in particular. It's hard to say in terms of the early Protestants and Calvinists and whatnot. That's not like they didn't love God and didn't respect Jesus, etc. But they certainly would have been thinking about things in their own way. That's not to say that doesn't also happen in the Catholic Church, by the way. It's not like we're all fallen human beings, okay? And we all make these same sorts of mistakes, whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. It's very easy to think of yourself more important than you really are, and to fail to realize who Jesus is.
Yeah. So Islam is my identity says, I love the Christians in the UK. They're respectful and tolerant people, and they allow us Muslims into their churches for iftar dinner and Ramadan and Eid celebrations. Do you? Yeah. Well, unfortunately, though, Islamic doctrine requires Muslims to hate the non-Muslim, the kafir. We are unclean. The Quran and these doctrines of Islam, like al-wala wal-bara, teaches that Muslims are to hate those who do not follow Islam, because this is in accord with what Abraham taught, and it's in accord with what Allah wants. So you have to hate who Allah hates. Nowhere does Allah preach love for the non-Muslim. And of course, you personally may be an enlightened human being. You may personally have better morals than your deen actually teaches you, but this doesn't change the deen. This doesn't change Islam. This doesn't change the doctrine. This doesn't change the teachings. You personally may be different, but then also this means that you are violating, you are breaking your commandments.
So an example of this too, in contrast, would be: are the Muslims in the UK tolerant enough to have a Catholic priest go into their church and pray the Hail Mary and Our Fathers and set up a cross? Would you be tolerant of that?
Yeah. Would they? Yeah, that's another good value. I was thinking of that. Yeah. So would you allow it? Would you be happy to use in your prayers the name of Jehovah? And would you, in your interfaith dialogue, think of God as the Father, Jesus as the Messiah, but as the Son of God? No, because this tolerance only goes in one direction. So yeah, so now early Protestant reformers like Calvin and Martin Luther in this paper argue that all one needs to interpret the Bible is the text and assistance from the Holy Spirit, and that's why we have thousands of competing and arguing and disagreeing denominations. So he argues against both positions, he writes. I show that these two separate interpretive frameworks, both of which exclude extra-textual information, yield interpretive results that are incoherent and contradictory, as I've already been discussing at length. I argue that this is because interpretable texts themselves cannot exist without a chain of interpretation. Therefore, by the time an interpreter interprets a text, a vast amount of extra-textual information has already been smuggled in. There are assumptions, there are traditions that are embedded there. Thus, the very act of interpretation employs extra-textual information, whether or not the interpreter believes that extra-textual information is required to interpret the text, which is a fairly valid point. I'm not going to do the whole paper, but just highlight this. Now, the Mutazilite influence on the Karaite interpretation of the Bible. These are Muslims. Again, this is a heretical Muslim sect, supposedly, that was wiped out in the 11th century. And in rejecting the oral law, the Karaites emancipated themselves from the rabbinical tradition, just like the Protestants liberated themselves from the Catholic tradition and the Pope. They set about interpreting the Bible using new methods, often influenced by Islam. This was their most notable undertaking, and that's a very interesting paper that discusses this. But even as the Karaites were developing their system, the Muslims had not yet worked out their definitive exegesis of the Quran. So this process went on for a long time. As we know, the Karaites took from the 6th to the 10th, 11th centuries to complete their final exegesis. and the final translation. So yeah, but they were very much influenced by Muslims. Why do we need people that are, let's just say, heavily influenced by Islam translating the Bible? Do you think that adds a question mark to whatever they come up with if they are using traditional Islamic interpretative methods, and if they are using methods applied to the Quran to now apply it to the Hebrew Bible and saying, hey, let's interpret the Bible using Muslim ideas? I'd say that screams problems to me, Jonas.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's I mean, one of the core features of Islam is the two houses, right? So you have the us and them type thing. You've got the house
The
of
Dar
Islam.
al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, yeah.
Yeah. So anybody outside of the house of Islam is automatically in a some form of state of war. It doesn't mean you actually like attack him willy-nilly, but there is, in a sense, that there's no excuse really needed to go to war. You just need to be in a position where you think you're going to win, I think. But to have that idea is just total in contrast to Christianity, right? Because in Christianity, we're supposed to love God, love your neighbor, love your enemy. And that love your enemy basically is a refutation of anything associated with this two houses concept.
Yeah.
The people who aren't Christians, we are to consider them potential Christians in the future, really. And so we need to love our enemies in the sense that we need to consider them as image bearers of God and who are potential fellow Christians and children of God. It's not something that whereas that's not really the case with Islam, is it? If you've gone through some of your hadith stuff, if you accidentally bump somebody off who was in the house of war, well, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. No, there's no consequence to it. I'll bring up a couple of questions and comments. Islam is my identity. I respect the Christians in the UK, and they respect us. So he personally, as one single lone ranger, respects the Christians, but the Christians respect the Muslims, because as a whole, Western Christian societies are very tolerant. White society is actually very tolerant and very respectful of other people. It's very accommodating. But unfortunately, the Muslims, as we have seen, are at the moment doing things like slamming cars into crowds, driving cars into Christmas markets, randomly going around putting knives into people's throats, attacking children, attacking women, attacking men, and blowing themselves up at concerts and various other things. As we are seeing of late, there's been a huge rise, and then lots of anti-Semitism, lots of church burnings. So, and also, of course, as you know, the world's most egregious rape scandal, which is still not being accurately and openly discussed in the UK, which is by 95% Muslims. That's a serious problem. And this is a serious problem. We don't invade random churches. Yeah, you burn them down. You burn them down. And of course, Christians may be tolerant because Christians also don't understand Islam. But there's also the fact that in the Sharia, Muslims are required to lie to make Islam dominant. So it's not just permitted to lie, it's required to lie. So the church authority has been miseducated on Islam. So they'll ask in the church, no, we would never do the opposite. Now, why would you never do the opposite? Now, why? That's hypocrisy. You see, because again, Abraham, according to Islam, teaches hatred of Jews and Christians. Your doctrine teaches you to hate, teaches you to be dominant. And that is not an equal position. That's a position that demonstrates hypocrisy and a hatred for your fellow man. Before any comment before we go on, Linus?
No, I think that's fine. I did have something, then I got distracted with my bloody phone and forgot it. Sorry.
Yeah. Phil says a significant percentage of Christians hate Catholics. I don't have good evidence, but just anecdotal. In my experience,
That's so annoying. Honestly, what happened to all the Christians for the last 1,500 years before the Protestant movement? Were they not Christians?
Of course not. Today, of course not.
Catholics today much different from those people?
Christianity started with Martin Luther.
It's just stupid, honestly.
Sorry, Villains, I interrupted you there. Just repeat your last few sentences again, please. Your last point.
It's just that the whole idea is crazy. For the first 1500 years, that's all there were Catholics, really. I'm including Orthodox, really, because there was they're still talking to each other, right? It's not like it is a schism, but it's a semi-schism. But the end of the day, for 1500 years, people have been Catholics. It's not like there was no Christians for that period of time. So the Catholics of today, are they that much different from what they were, say, in the 1400s? You could argue, yeah, okay, maybe there's some cultural difference, but the actual underlying religion is pretty consistent, right?
Yeah, that's my view as well.
Yeah. So what is with this hating Catholics bit then?
It's like that really becomes entrenched. That becomes entrenched with Martin Luther. Martin Luther developed a hatred. I mean, if I've read through Martin Luther's hatred of Catholics and Jews in the past, I've done works on that. The man was vile. I mean, vile. If you think Muhammad was nasty when he spoke about Jews and Christians, Martin Luther went 2 stages past that. Martin Luther was absolutely despicable in his language. I mean, he'd make a sailor blush the way that man just was. He was vindictive. Martin Luther was a vindictive man, and so there's definitely
it's like hating yourself in a way.
Yeah. Okay. So look, so Islam is my identity. This is the last comment of yours that I'm going to address, and that's it. We're done having this off-topic conversation. You have failed to acknowledge the fact that, as I showed, your religion teaches hatred. Your Allah is a God of hatred. Your religion explicitly in its creed teaches hatred of Christians and hatred of Jews. You personally are required to hate us. That is your commandment from Allah, from Abraham, from Muhammad. Now, whether you personally don't, that's nice, but you don't represent Islam. You are just an aberration. In fact, this might make you an apostate, but your religion explicitly teaches such hatred. So
it's not even ruksa, that sort of thing, isn't it? Loving Christians, it's not even a generic requirement. It's
it's part of
an aberration on the side. Yeah.
So if you can show us where Allah teaches, because I can show you where Allah teaches hatred, that you are required as a Muslim to hate me, to hate Villain, to hate everyone who's not a Muslim. If you can show us where Allah teaches love thy neighbor, to love your neighbor, if you can show me that, that would be great. Otherwise, enough of discussion with you. Okay. Okay, so let's see. I'm not going to go too much depth in here. So the Karaite movement originated in Iraq and Persia. Oh my gosh, in Islamic lands in the second half of the 9th century, was a result of the cultural exchange between Judaism and Islam. Interesting. Mutazilism constituted one of the elements of Islam that had a determining influence on Karaism during its formative phase. Oh my gosh, let me see these Jewish Muslims. Good grief. And yeah, we really need them to retranslate the Bible, because Muslims really have a respect for Jesus, don't they? So let me see. The majority of Karaite texts were composed in Judeo-Arabic. It was easy for the principles of Mutazilism and of Islam to make inroads in Karaite literature, and these guys were integral to the translation of the Masoretic text. Isn't that shocking? Mutazilism, yeah.
So it'd be good to get Mel's view on that, because he's been doing some research on the Judaic influences early on in Islam, and that there's just looking at there's some sort of back and forth going on there, and it's you're talking about Karaitism and Mutazilism there, but I think it could be broader than that. I think Mel would be the best person.
I raised it with Mel. I was on a stream a week ago, 10 days ago, with Mel and Saint Murad, and this was new to both of them.
Right.
So I should actually maybe plan something, give them some notes to look at, and I showed them some of this. I went into some depth on some of it. The notes that I've skipped over, which I covered before, which I can't be bothered to do now, but they were both amazed by it. So Mal was like, yeah, I think this definitely is in Mal's ballpark. It's definitely the stuff that he's
because he is doing some work on looking at early Islam being like a messianic Jewish movement,
Yeah, well,
which has some merit. Like, because I think with Mel, he's trying to. The field is fairly sparse. I mean, Islam has been very good at destroying its own history, and so we're piecing together. Not me personally, but like the people on YouTube, etc., people like Mel and Jay and whatnot, they're piecing together little scratchy parts, trying to make something coherent, which is something that the Islamic world doesn't want to touch, of course, because it's they got rid of all that stuff for a reason. They want a certain view to survive, and that's it. But so, I'm not going to say Mel is absolutely correct in what he's going through, but it's a worthwhile process to analyze, to see what's going on in the early stages. And that's a theory about how it began in terms of some form of messianic Jewish movement. And it needs to be looked at and reviewed. If it's wrong, it's wrong. But if it has merit, then we should pursue it.
You just think the Masoretes are roughly contemporaneous with the start of Islam. This very same group that comes along, the Masoretes, that now these masters of the text that come along and redo the Bible, they are contemporaneous with the foundation of Islam. And you just wonder, did the egg have a chicken here?
Yeah.
Or did the chicken have an egg? We have to wonder, like, are the two connected somehow? And then Masudi, a well-known Muslim scholar, said that the Karaites are the Mutazilites of the Jewish community. These Jews, a little bit Muslimified here, They are carrying on the Muslim tradition within Judaism. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides points out the influence of Mutazilism on certain Geonim and Karaite theologians. That means that certain of these people who were running these yeshivas, these Jewish schools of learning, were influenced by the Muslims, because there was a lot of back and forth between these two groups. And the 14th century Karaite, Aaron Aliyah, reports Mutazilism influence. And some of these guys had Arabic names. They'd be called Ahmad something, Muslim names, these typical Arabic names, these Jews with Arab names. You wonder, like, okay. So the 14th century Karaite reports Mutazilism's influence on the first Karaites. When Israel split apart into two sects, the Karaites and the Rabbinites, the Karaite sages and a small number of Rabbinites embraced the Mutazilite doctrine. So they became Muslimified. And that already starts to tell us how Jewish influence entered into Islam, and potentially how Islamic influence may have entered into Judaism. Daniel Kamisi, the first Karaite whose name has come down to us, was already a Mutazilite. And all of these guys, of course, were very much involved with translation of the Old Testament, which is disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if this Mutazilite people are just people who took the more literally the idea of Muhammad blessing the Torah, which is a problem in with Islam, isn't it? Like you hear a lot of polemics about Muhammad actually accepting the Torah as it was, but somehow or other, miraculously, it's been corrupted and we can't use it anymore. Some of these things sound like there's been some movements in the past trying to bring the two together, and maybe this is one of them.
I think that the Quran actually speaks of this. It speaks of the conflict between the Septuagint and the Masoretic, and these Jews that were aligned with them versus the Jews that were not. I mean, there seems to be. I'll just read I'm just going to do the highlight here, right? This is the Karaites and Mutazilism. I can't make this larger, unfortunately. Right? In the time of the Geonim, the directors of the Talmudic academies, Karaism was greatly influenced by the Muslim theological movement, the Mutazilites. So the Karaites adopted the doctrinal fundamentals of Mutazilism, both in the area of scriptural exegesis and in theological themes. So beginning in the 11th century, the Karaites settled in Jerusalem, set out to compose theological texts, creating a genre in their own right. And they were caught up in the polemics pervading the Mutazilite movement of the time. They contributed towards the spread of Muslim Mutazilite doctrine within the Fatimid Caliphate. And then also, when the center of gravity of Karaism shifted to Byzantium in the 12th century, and this is why I have a problem with the Eastern Orthodox. Some Karaite Mutazilite literary works were translated from Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew, even as new Karaite works of Mutazilite inspiration continued to be composed there. So a breach opened eventually between the Karaites and Mutazilism under the influence of the philosophy spread by the Rabbinite writings. So there were things going on theologically, and this is why I constantly, when I look at what happened with Eastern Orthodox, I see a Muslim influence, and this particular influence was in that stronghold of Byzantium, and I just have concerns that there's a Sufi influence in Eastern Orthodox.
Just thinking of the timing of that. When the Masoretic text, how old is it? It's actually not as old as people think. That
It was completed roughly 1008, just after the beginning of the 11th century. So 1010, in the year 1010, roughly. So it's actually with the Septuagint is about 12 to 1300 years older to BC era. That's the difference.
Yeah, it's sneaky because it's in Hebrew, but it's not actually newer. It's newer, sorry, rather than ancient. Yeah.
And it's not a one-to-one correlation with the original Hebrew that the Septuagint is based on. It's actually not a one-to-one. So people think, because it's the original Hebrew, it's therefore the same as the original text that the Septuagint comes from, and that's not true. So
yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls help out with that a bit too. I think they're more consistent with the Septuagint too, aren't they? I'm not sure. I might be going down a rabbit hole there, but it's I think it's the Dead Sea Scrolls are quite important as a bit of a snapshot. I mean, I know they're not perfect scrolls, and some of them have deteriorated quite badly, but it's still quite important.
Yeah. So I'll just go on. Hopefully, I can get past this section and move on to the rest of my talk, which is simpler. But Karaites, Islamic Jewish Protestants. So this is another paper, Polyak, 2006. So Karaism between Judaism and Islam. And it says, according to these scholars, the contribution of Islam was in encouraging and creating the right conditions for these trends, these scripturalist trends. In other words, for the Karaites to adopt Islamic Quranic style exegesis and interpretation methods. And then these scripturalist trends were to surface and manifest themselves openly. Interesting. It's almost like Muslims may have incubated this movement, this Jewish heretical movement, like they may have a hand in starting it, in creating heresies to infect Judaism and creating heresies as we can, when I do my series on Unitarianism and we go to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and you look at these heresies that arise, like Unitarianism and other heresies, you might start to think that the Muslims might have been whispering in people's ears and saying, hey, we'll give you a little bit of money. How about you start a heresy that goes against Christianity as it's been practiced for the last 1500 years? What do you say? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Your thoughts, Villain?
Yeah, well, it's, some of those movements definitely are a dive back into Islamic ideas, because in Islam, Allah's a monad, right? It's just like this single entity.
Yep.
Whereas in Christianity, God is one, as in echad. It's a unity.
Complex unity, correct? Yeah. Echad,
yeah. So it's quite different, and yeah, it's I think the way, the beauty of it is actually in terms of the Islamic view, is that it's easy to understand, and but just because something's easy to understand doesn't make it right.
Correct.
You know, like Newtonian mechanics, for example, is fairly easy to understand. I mean, a lot of people, in comparison to, say, Einsteinian ideas, all right. So, but Einstein is more complex than Newtonian mechanics, but it's correct in comparison. Like, it's Newtonian mechanics is great for general use, but if you're trying to do whiz bang stuff in a cosmic scale, it's useless. It just doesn't work. And so in that sense, it's wrong. It's okay for being an engineer or something.
Pause a moment. Here you go. You see, eternal Islam. Eternal Islam, you're doing Islam wrong. Islam's supposed to be a religion of peace, not a religion of hatred. So it says, we did burn a church in Pakistan because they burn our Quran. Actions have consequences. They can't walk free. Every country has laws. Well, Muslims are driving over into Christmas markets and driving over children and stabbing children in streets randomly. So you are okay then if we bomb your countries, right? You're okay with the US bombing your countries. You're fine with the US bombing Muslims. You're okay with Israel bombing Muslims because you guys are, not just matter of burning Qurans, but you guys are blowing yourselves up at concerts. You're stabbing people, driving into Christmas markets. I'm sure you're fine with that. You see? So yeah, so guys, Eternal Islam, you cannot go away permanently. And let me see. Let me just go back.
Burner account from
Islam
the
is my
other
identity. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
guy. It's probably a burner account from the other guy.
Yeah, very possibly. And thank you for silencing or muting at least Islam is my identity. So yeah, just put him on timeout for the next half hour or the next day or something, because enough time wasted on dealing with these off-topic issues. Let's just go back to the subject at hand. Yeah, I mean, look, if this is the view of Muslims, and he's perfectly correct because they have to hate. Islam is a religion of hatred. It is not a religion of peace. They can't prove that to you from their doctrine. I can prove that it's hatred. That's easy. So yeah, that's the same person.
It's only called a religion of peace for the propaganda in the West.
Yeah,
It's not peace; it's submission.
yeah. So there was someone that left a question. I'm just trying to find. I may have missed it. Gosh, I can't find it now. Yeah, thanks, Dragon, for yeah. By the way, I need to say thank you to someone. I need to thank a Dalton Hawkins. Thank you very much. I just received a donation from someone, and just want to say thank you to that. I got a notification in email, so thank you very much. Yeah, let's continue with this. Right. So the major drive behind Karaism is external to Judaism. In other words, an outside influence led to the rise of Karaism, almost like the Muslims were doing it. It was borrowed or grafted onto it from Islamic models. Interesting. So somehow these guys came along with a bunch of Islamic ideas, and somehow some force outside of Judaism was pushing these guys to bring these Islamic ideas into Judaism, like they were trying to bring Islam into Judaism, and like they were started by Muslims who might have wanted to make this happen. So scholars give precedence to the Islamic milieu, blah, they speak of blah, blah, contact, providing detailed arguments concerning the level of Karaite borrowing from Islamic concepts, methodology, and religious customs. So yeah, it sounds to me like this wasn't an accident. It sounds to me like it's something the Muslims were behind. And if you go back to the 15th century, you might find that the same thing was happening to the church. So yeah. And then others go further in considering the role of heterodox Islam as crucial to the birth of Karaism, and as we would term it, the altering of the biblical translation, to the extent that it would not otherwise have appeared on the historical horizon of medieval Judaism. Some even suggest that all new content brought to Judaism through Karaism, was Islamic in origin. Hence, its depiction as a form of Islamic Judaism. So yeah, this looks like a conspiracy by Muslims. And you can see the same in the 15th century in Eastern Europe to undermine the church.
Yeah, like the determinism is an Islamic concept, really, that's crept into, well, particularly Calvinism. But I was just thinking on that's also in atheism too, isn't it? Like there's this desire for determinism, which is an Islamic concept.
Yeah, and the weird thing is when you look through Darwin got a lot of ideas from the Sufis, from Muslims. Yeah, crazy amount of Darwin's ideas is actually Muslim ideas, and you're like, huh? And the weird part is it's from Muslim poetry. Like, yeah, scientific my ass. So, Peter Hamlet, there's a word for what you just wrote, and it's called bullshit. Yeah. So let me see. Yusuf, oh, it's so sad, but so just ban him, Dragon. I mean, this guy's just wasting our time now. You know,
it's just creating new accounts. It's just annoying.
Yeah, just ban this twat. Yeah, just get rid of him for wasting our time now. So, but hopefully he will have no problem when the Israelis or the Americans bomb them back because of burning churches. I mean, if we burn Qurans, you burn the church. When you burn the church, we bomb you back. It's like just how it goes, right? Just one of those things. Right. Okay, let's continue. Now, St. Augustine, City of God, Book 1. I want to get past this section so I can get into the rest of this stuff. So, also, this is from St. Augustine, City of God, Book 18, Chapter 43. Okay, so, for a while, there were other interpreters who translated these sacred oracles out of the Hebrew tongue into Greek. Now, he mentions Aquilus, Symmachus, and Theodotion. And these guys were starting with new translations of the Hebrew that were variants that moved away from the Septuagint because they clearly wanted to separate this Hebrew translation, the Jewish one, from the Christian one. So that started very early on. And also that translation, which as the name of the author is unknown, is quoted in the 5th edition. Yet the church has received this Septuagint translation just as if it were the only one. So according to St. Augustine, the church inherited the Septuagint. This was and is a correct translation. Now, don't forget, I've mentioned between the 15th and the 18th centuries, Protestants were explicit in claiming that the Septuagint is corrupt. The Bible is corrupt. We can't use that Bible. It's corrupt, which is a Muslim argument being made by Protestants, denying that the apostles had the correct Bible, which is, to me, shocking. And it has been used by the Greek Christian people, most of whom are not aware that there is any other Bible. From this translation, there's also been made a translation in the Latin tongue, which the Latin churches use. And although the Jews acknowledge this very learned labor to be faithful, right, that's of those translators, while they contend that the Septuagint translators have erred in many places, the churches of Christ judge that no one should be preferred to the authority of so many men. So now they also speak of Justin Martyr, I think it's Justin Martyr who made his translation. Was it Justin? Anyway, but here you've got a translation by 70 of the very best Jewish translators. And suddenly, for centuries, that is the Bible used all across the Jewish world. And then suddenly one day, oh, it's corrupt. It's wrong. So, yeah, a little bit of hypocrisy there, to my mind. Your thought there, Billy?
It's sort of, you can sort of see, if it was something like trying to translate an original one into something that was useful and on the side, that's one thing. Because a lot of our English translations are like that, aren't they? You think about it, we go back to the original Greek and we make a translation, which is not really how Muslims view what we do, but it is what we do. And they're of various needs. Some are more literal, some are more phrase for phrase type. So in that sense, and that's trying to communicate right to people, right? Using the best of their ability, really. And you could argue maybe they're doing that, but are they really, or is this just something that I've got the shits for the Jews now. I don't want anything to do with what they've done, and I'm going to make something up new. It's almost the reverse of what the Jews have been trying to do with the text that they're using. Is geez, we don't want anything in here to do with Christians. Let's see if we can tweak it at that.
Notice here, look here, this Muslim warrior, watch out, when you flood Poland, you will regret your crusade against Islam. You have been warned. You know,
it's the same guy, probably.
Yeah, very likely. I'm just going to put this on X quickly because...
That's a good one. I mean, that's the attitude there is about it's like pure hate, right?
Yeah, it's hatred.
Whereas in the Christian attitude, look, we don't agree with your religion. It's not like we're going to hate you and burn your city down. Whereas that's what his attitude is. Oh, we hate you, and now we're going to knock you all off. It's a completely different attitude.
I mean, he's got a knife there and blood. So this tells you it's not a religion of peace. It's a lie. It's gaslighting. They're just gaslighting you. Islam is a religion of hatred. It is hate speech. In exactly as those laws claim hate. This is the sheer definition of hate speech. Islam is hate speech. It is deceit. It is lies. So that's what it is. Just like that. And I mean, they did invade Poland. They were kicked out. And the one interesting thing is, though, that people say, well, by 2050, Muslims are going to be 99.7% of all people in Europe if things continue. But it's like, it's like saying, this morning it was 6 degrees Celsius, but by 10 a.m. it was 19 degrees, and by 11 a.m. it was 25 degrees, and by 5 p.m. today it's going to be 93 degrees Celsius during the day. It's like, no, it's not a linear thing. At some point it gets cooler. At some points things change. And at some point, people are going to go, we really don't like Islam because these guys are just not being very nice. And at some point, there's going to be pushback. You're assuming there's going to be zero pushback. You're assuming there's going to be zero social change. And that's, people need to realize that Europe has been very good at killing people on an industrial scale multiple times throughout history. And you really want to bear that in mind.
They are poking the bear. The other thing is, too, those stats that the people saying that, it's going to overflow everywhere, they're old. The reality is that their birth rates are dropping everywhere, and they're not converting people. The people who are convert last like 5 minutes and realize
and leave.
And leave.
And Mal showed that those conversion stats are from the 60s.
Yeah,
I mean, that's decades ago.
Yeah, it's just useless. The reality is they're not having 6 kids anymore. They're still better than the West. I'm not saying that the West hasn't been indoctrinated by extremists that they're forcing everybody to not have kids. That is the case. People are only having 1.5 kids. That's not sustainable. People need to wake up and they're told fibby-wibbies. But the Islamic world is not 6 and 7 like you've heard for those stats. It's only like 2 and a bit. It's just like replacement levels now. And obviously that's dropped, right? Which means there is a progression. It will drop further.
Things are changing. So let's finish this and we do one more page. Villain, we finish maybe this page and then we can pick this up another time. But I'm really glad that you came on. Something I've noticed, my talks often just meander and wander all over the place. But so he speaks here that the Septuagint was the work of Eleazar, who was then high priest, because he chose 70 men to do the translation of the Septuagint. And he says, even if there had not appeared in them one spirit, without doubt divine, and the 70 learned men had after the manner of men compared together the words of their translation, that what pleased them all might stand, no single translator ought to be preferred to them. He says these are 70 people who worked together, who came to an agreement, who checked each other's work, and eventually said, okay, yes, we think this is a good translation, and this should be preferred over the work of one man who makes up his own mind and no one tells him, and he just does it all by himself. So he says, but since so great a sign of divinity has appeared in them, and that's reference to the Septuagint, that it is divine. Of course, the Westminster Confession of Faith says, no, it's not. It's not. The New Testament in Greek is divine, but the Old Testament in Greek, that's just fake. That's corrupt. Oh, good grief. Which is kind of hypocritical, but fine.
Yeah.
It says, if he is not found to agree with them, then we ought to believe that the prophetic gift is with them. That's the 70 who created the Septuagint. So if one guy says, these 70 translators who were the very best, so we're talking a non-Jewish translator who then says, those 70 Jews are all wrong. He says, maybe we need to go with 70 over the one. For the same spirit who was in the prophets when they spoke these things was also in the 70 men when they translated that Old Testament. So St. Augustine, there's a much longer treatise, there's a much bigger discussion to be had, but St. Augustine really wasn't happy with St. Jerome, I believe it was, not Justin Jerome, doing his new translation, which in large part rejected the Septuagint. And he argued against it, but he vouches here for the authenticity of the Septuagint. That was St. Augustine's position.
It is reading between the lines. It stinks a bit of anti-Semitism there. I don't know if you noticed that. It just there's a subtly.
Sorry.
It just reading between the lines. It smells a bit of anti-Semitism. Did you see that?
Yes, actually, that's an interesting observation. Yeah, I didn't notice it till now, but you're right. Yes, go on.
It just seems to me like they're not happy that the Jews actually created a Septuagint and they're trying to get something different. And this is a problem with the church over a long period of time, and hopefully we're growing out of it. And to be honest, I think the genuine Christians are growing out of it. Is this sense that the filthy, the old filthy Jews, the big nose, that sort of thing. The pictures from the Nazi rumor mill. That sort of idea has been around a long time, and it's embarrassing, guys. We need to get out of that. And and it's quite old, like it's not new. And if you speak to Jews, that they're not happy with Christians because of it. You know, there's a it's not like they're hateful in particular, but like they're aware that anti-Semitism will creep back into a Christian fold very easily, and it's actually ignorant of how Christianity began, to be honest. And I think that's part of what Augustine is trying to mention here, is that, you know, Christ used the Septuagint. Why would you choose something else? The Septuagint was created by 70 Jews.
I think that's a valid question. Christ used it. The apostles used it. Why would you reject it in favor of a new translation that comes 1,000 years later?
Yeah. And
that denies Jesus' divinity. It's like, this makes no sense to me.
What's the motivation for you doing something different? What are you thinking about? You know, you basically what you're saying, those 70 Jewish scholars from 200 BC or whenever it was, 100 to 200 BC, they're all wrong, you know. And Jesus must have been wrong too, wasn't he? Because he used it as a naughty boy.
Yeah, Jesus didn't know any better. Unfortunately, fortunately, you had Martin come along and fix that.
So yeah, it just stunk a bit. It just didn't sit right with me. I mean, you know, I don't know enough about it, but it just something a bit behind it said, that doesn't sound right. You know, there's something behind that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much argument on both sides, but once you look at it, the argument is changing. The evidence is coming forward now, and that the Septuagint is valid. I mean, you can see there's a change coming. New research is bringing new evidence. Let's finish this page, and I think I can call it a day here. So the Masoretic text was created by anti-Christian Jewish scholars in the medieval period who explicitly rejected Christ's divinity. I think that's a fair assessment of the argument here. They deliberately altered the text to remove obscure references to Christ's divinity and messianic prophecies, as we are discovering in the 21st century from new discoveries of older Hebrew texts, other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, which show that the Septuagint was quoting, the Greek Septuagint was quoting legitimate Hebrew translations that are ancient, that are pre-Christianity, hundreds of years pre-Christianity.
That's right. The monad Judaism of today is not the what was at the time of Jesus. The two powers in heaven was quite a strong concept. It's only a rabbinical Judaism, which is actually newer than Christianity, is more a monad type religion.
That's another oddity. Yeah. Jesus didn't know any better. Exactly. Fortunately, Martin and John came along, and Calvin came along and fixed that mistake. Yeah, the Septuagint predates Christianity and thus could not have been biased towards Christian interpretation. Right? But of course, the Jews didn't like it, that it said the things it said that were clearly messianic. Jesus and the apostles quoted from the Septuagint, not from what would later become the Masoretic. The Dead Sea Scrolls often align with Septuagint readings against the Masoretics, proving the Septuagint preserves older Hebrew readings. As we've shown already in other discussions, we've gone over new findings that show that the Masoretic is wrong and the Septuagint has the correct translation because it's in the original Hebrew. And the Masoretic is a medieval Jewish reaction against Christianity, not an authentic preservation of the original Hebrew text. Now, there'll be areas where it's correct, certainly, but there's also a change in the translation to take on a different angle, which denies divinity, denies certain miracles, and so on. So I'll use this page last. So this is the final one I'll end here. So sure, Jesus and the apostles used it, but. So the argument that the use of the Septuagint by Jesus and the apostles does not justify preferring it over the Masoretic is completely invalid. And I've seen this argument made. Okay, so Jesus used it, but it's corrupt, but it's this, but it's that, but you need more evidence. Look, I mean, if Jesus liked coffee and John Calvin comes along and says, no, you have to drink tea, I would tell Calvin to F off. I think it's as simple as that. Excuse my French. Well, what do you think?
Well, there's two things. I mean, you find that the some of the apostles and whatnot would quote other documents, and now they're in the New Testament, right? And they make Jewish documents, but non-Jewish documents. Now those wouldn't have been divine, but they were just utilized for a purpose. Now there's a bit of a difference between that and a divine Old Testament text. that would have been used. So there's a different focus. You're grabbing some random information to create a point, or am I going to actually refer to a biblical text to make a point? They're two different approaches, and you can't mix them up. And I think that's what these guys are doing. Septuagint is validated by Christ due to who he is and how he walked the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So the Septuagint is justified as the historic biblical holy text as a result. You can't use that argument on the books that were quoted randomly to make a point, because we already know that they're not. They're just there to make a point. So there's that difference, and there's confusion here. So basically what you're saying is that, oh no, Jesus used the Septuagint as random text to make a point, rather than using it as a holy book. You see what I mean? And so there's a subtle difference there, and you shouldn't mix them up. The Septuagint was classed as a holy book by Christ, and he used it.
It was the Bible of the apostles.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is invalid. It ignores the fact that the Masoretic text was compiled by those who rejected Jesus' divinity, and they altered the text to erase references to him. This seems to be this is the conclusion that I've come to, and this is the conclusion that seems to be evident. And this is where the evidence seems to be leading if you start reading some of the new evidence that is being found. So Jesus and the apostles used the Septuagint as scripture, not just as a book to make a point, as you said. Very well said, Willem. The Masoretic was created centuries later by people who explicitly rejected Jesus' divinity. Now you can say, well, the Masoretic was based on earlier Hebrew scriptures that already existed. Yeah, well, so was the Septuagint. And your point being, but the Masoretic is a tradition of translation that was made by people who were very Islamified, for one, which is a problem, and two, they rejected Jesus' divinity. So yeah, the same people deliberately altered text to remove references to Christ. I mean, I think then arguing that we should prefer the Masoretic over the Septuagint implies and means that we reject the version of Scripture that Jesus himself used, that the apostles used. We prefer a version created by his explicit opponents. I think that's rather stupid, and we accept deliberate anti-Christian alteration which actually erase Jesus' divinity, his miraculous actions, and his worship from the text, and you don't find Jesus anymore. So far, what do you think of this? I mean, these are. Yeah.
I think we've commented about this already in a lot of ways. Yeah, the key takeaway is who is Christ and what did he use? But the people who are avoiding Christ are trying to create a new narrative, which is what the rabbinic Judaism is doing, right? Because I think one of the problems is with rabbinic Judaism is regularly over a long period of time it's been a right field for Christians to be converted from, because there is that connection. All of a sudden people realize, oh, hang on, Jesus actually does meet all the Old Testament criteria. How do you cope with that? And the way you cope with that is to take on Christianity, right?
Exactly. Unless you remove all those Old Testament criteria, the prophecies from the Old Testament, and then Jesus is nobody.
Yeah, that's it. Don't forget that all the first Christians, all they had was the Old Testament. That's what they were using.
Fair point. And yes, exactly.
They were justifying their religion completely on the Old Testament at the start.
Exactly, because the prophecies of the Old Testament that were now fulfilled in their sight. Yep. So this means that Protestants who reject this Bible claim to know better than Jesus and the apostles which version of Scripture is authoritative. I mean, that's a very strong claim to make. So this is like claiming to follow George Washington while rejecting the US Constitution in favor of a British revision written in 1850 that removes all references to independence of America. I mean, that's a self-contradictory and logically indefensible position. It's completely absurd. I'll pause here on this one. And here's a question: if Scripture alone is authoritative, what Scripture authorized the canon? Because if it's not in the Quran, then it's not real, right?
Yeah, whose authority was it that said that Scripture alone was correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
The
So
problem
there's
is that you deny traditions and then you create new ones immediately straight away. That's the problem. You know, you say that
that's actually
by the very fact of saying sola scriptura is a thing, that is a new tradition you just made.
it's a fair point. I think it's a very fair understanding of the problem. I mean, that's what Villain. You have amazing insight. I mean, genuinely, you have also an amazing way with words. The way that you just raise an argument or just make an argument clear. Pardon me, it's really impressive. I mean, hopefully you can join me. We can do this again in a week if you're available. If the time is not, otherwise, let me know what time works for you, and I'll schedule it at a time that's convenient for you.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
The problem with me is that you and I are complete opposite sides of the world, and so it's actually here it's only it's 10 to 7. So I've been up since 5 o'clock. So it's quite early. Like I have to get up and do something. So sometimes you've been on and I've just been totally knackered and I haven't been able to come on when you've asked me. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah. I mean, we can try and change the. I'll change my stream time to later or sooner or something if it's possible to make it work for you. You know, I can go later, for instance. You know, if I have to or more.
Yeah. It probably depends on the day too. Like if I can nip back to bed afterwards on the weekend, it's not so bad.
Okay. Yeah. I'd love to have.
I think the only hassle with the weekends is that obviously got church and whatnot. I'm also I do Bible studies with Thaddeus as well, so that sort of that chews up a bit of time. That's an online thing. So Dragana, who's still here, honestly still here, she sometimes pops onto that. But anyway, oh, there she does. There you go. She's here.
Yeah, I can always invite a few of you guys on at some point, and we can just talk about these issues, these discussions. But yeah, let's
I
call
won't
it
have to come on again. It's just if I'm half dead, you're not going to get much out of me. So it wasn't too bad today.
Yeah. No, thank you. Really appreciate it. So guys, we'll end here. By the way, I've got a guy called well, let me just bring it up, brother. Easier. I'm busy talking to someone. Let me just open that. So I'm just trying to bring this up to show you. Yeah, so guys, in a couple of days on the 19th, I'm talking to, this is not Ibn Warak, it's different. It's Ibn al-Warak. I'll be speaking with him. This is an Egyptian. He has an interesting history, and he's going to talk about Islam. He's very well versed in history of Islam, in its ideology, and yeah. But I don't want to say too much because he needs to maintain his anonymity for his safety. But also, let's just say this guy has been in the thick of it, and I'll let him answer if he wants to say more and provide any details about this.
There's quite a few guys from Egypt who are helping out with this. I mean, the reality is that the Egyptian people have been living with the pressure of Islam since the start, and they're still there. Even though they're only 10% of the population there now, the Christian population there is copped the brunt for a long time, and are very well aware of the background. So yeah, these guys are great.
Yeah, he's actually, I believe, is a Muslim convert to Christianity.
Right.
So he actually comes from the other side, and let's just say he was deep in the thick of it. Let's leave it at that. So I'll let him explain further. So this guy, eventually kind of saw the error of his ways. So this should be an interesting conversation. This guy seems to know quite a bit, and it'll be a very interesting conversation. I've also reached out to Raymond Ibrahim. I last communicated with him about 4 years ago, but I really want to start having that conversation with him because he's a brilliant author, guy's a brilliant historian, really knowledgeable, and I've reached out to him. So let's hope something works. And yeah, and I've got some other. Yeah,
he's been a bit more active recently too, so he might be keen to catch up with you actually, just to spread the word a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So if people can just contact him, that'll be great. Just let him know that.
I don't know him personally. I could make a note in his one of
Twitter
his
or something. Just drop him in. Just tag him on Twitter. But yeah, I'm trying to talk to some of these people because knowledge of the Sharia is growing. People are starting to understand the Sharia. They're starting to see its significance and how it the explanatory power. So things are improving. So yeah, let me call it a night. I'll be on again soon, and not since Desert Storm. Yeah, well, Mad Monk. So that's interesting. Yeah, you were out there as well. So yeah, guys, thank you very much. It's been really, hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation, learned a great deal. Thank you for joining us, Villain. It's always a pleasure. Really,
worries.
I've learned a lot from your ability to explain things and your insights. Let's hope we can do this again.
No worries.
Always welcome. And next time, maybe we should bring Dragon up. What do you think? We'll invite her as well. You know?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, she's got
join
to
the
put up with it. She's got a strong accent, so you've got to cope with that. That's all right.
Man, we'll translate, I'm sure.
No, it's fine. Her English is very good. It's just I've got to probably have a strong Australian accent, and she's got a strong Eastern European accent. So that's just the way it is.
Yeah, well, luckily I have a mild South African accent, so yeah. So guys, yeah, let's call it a night here, Dragon. We will see you next time soon. So guys, thank you very much. I hope it was entertaining as well as educational and that you learned something. So there's a lot more to this. These simple answers don't always work. There's a lot of history that needs to be explored. Hopefully we realize now there's questions to be asked, and rather than just assumptions to be made. So till next time, guys, I will see you all soon.
All right.
Take care.
Peace, everyone.